On a quiet afternoon in 1985, the kind that seemed to shimmer with the golden haze of late summer, a father climbed onto the roof of his modest family home. To anyone watching from the street, it was an ordinary sight, almost comforting in its simplicity. A man in worn jeans and a faded shirt, hammer tucked into his belt, shingles stacked neatly by his side. He had done this sort of repair countless times before. He moved with the steady assurance of someone who understood both the house and the life within it. Neighbors later remembered how the sun was strong that day, the light reflecting off the pale roof so brightly it was almost blinding. Birds circled lazily overhead, and children played in the street below, their laughter faintly rising through the warm air. It was a scene that should have been unremarkable, one of those forgettable details of suburban life that dissolve into memory with the years. But what followed ensured it would never be forgotten. For at some point that afternoon, when the hammers grew quiet and the neighbors turned back to their routines, the man who had been repairing his roof simply ceased to be. One moment, he was seen adjusting a ladder, the next there was only an eerie stillness. By dusk, when the sky shifted from gold to deepening blue, no one had seen him descend. The ladder still leaned against the house, his tools remained scattered neatly, and yet he was gone. The family inside assumed at first he had taken a break, perhaps gone to fetch something, maybe even slipped inside without a word. But as the minutes stretched into hours, unease began to grow. His wife called for him through the open windows, her voice carrying across the yard, unanswered. The children, young and uncertain, peered out toward the roof expecting him to appear with his easy smile and reassuring presence. Instead, there was nothing but silence. That silence became the defining memory of the day. Neighbors would later describe it as unsettling, the way an ordinary afternoon suddenly seemed to lose its shape, as if time itself had been interrupted. One woman claimed she heard an unusual thud, but when she looked out her window there was no sign of anyone on the lawn or driveway. Another neighbor swore she saw him still on the roof just moments before the family began their frantic search. Their stories conflicted, blurred by shock in the years that would follow, but one detail remained consistent: no one saw him leave. The absence was so sudden, so complete, it felt less like a disappearance and more like a vanishing act, something pulled from the realm of nightmares or whispered legends. His wife later described the moment as though the world had split in two, the life she thought she knew, and the shadowy unknown that followed. The man who fixed the roof in the late afternoon sun had been her anchor, and in a single day, that anchor was severed. The police were called, though at first the officers seemed skeptical. People do not simply disappear while repairing a roof. They asked questions about drinking, about whether he had been troubled or planning to leave. The wife shook her head, her denial sharp and desperate, insisting he would never abandon his family. His tools were there, his shoes, his unfinished work. Everything spoke of a man who intended to return at any moment. And yet night came, and still he was gone. For the children, the memory would always carry an air of unreality. One recalled staring at the rooftop long after dark, waiting for the familiar silhouette to appear against the stars. Another remembered the strange quiet of the house, the way whispers replaced laughter, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile line between hope and despair. Their lives were altered not by violence or spectacle, but by a silence so profound it became a presence in itself. In the weeks that followed, people tried to make sense of what had happened. Some speculated about an accident, that he had fallen and wandered off injured, perhaps disoriented. Others whispered of something stranger, that maybe he had secrets no one knew, and his disappearance was no accident at all. These theories were little comfort to the family. To them, he was a father, a husband, a man who had been fixing the roof on an ordinary afternoon. His absence carved an invisible scar through their lives, one that would never fully heal. The image of him on the roof, hammer glinting in the sun, became the last confirmed moment of his existence. It was a memory frozen in amber, retold again and again by those who had been there. And with each telling, the details grew sharper: the sound of the hammer, the angle of the sun, the way the air felt heavy, charged, as though the world had been holding its breath. From that day forward, the house was not just a family home. It became the place where a man vanished into silence, leaving behind nothing but questions and the ache of absence. Inside the home he left behind, life began to unravel in quiet, devastating ways. The house that once echoed with ordinary sounds, the hum of the radio in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards as he walked through the hall, the clatter of dishes at dinner, now felt suffocating in its stillness. His wife sat at the edge of the dining table night after night, staring at his untouched chair as though willing him to materialize again. She kept his plate in the cupboard, polished, unused, unwilling to acknowledge that he might never need it. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a gesture of denial, but to her, it was survival. If she let go of these small rituals, then she would be admitting the unthinkable, that he was not coming back. The children carried the absence differently, their grief coloring their routines in subtle but piercing shades. The eldest son, barely a teenager, tried to assume responsibilities too large for his shoulders. He would insist on checking the locks at night, helping with bills he couldn't quite understand, mowing the lawn with a sense of grim determination. In his silence was an anger he couldn't voice, anger at his father for leaving, anger at the world for offering no explanation. His younger sister, on the other hand, retreated inward. She scribbled notes in the margins of her schoolbooks, poems about shadows and missing faces, drawings of rooftops that stretched impossibly high into the sky. The youngest, too small to grasp the weight of it all, wandered the house at night calling for Daddy, her voice thin, almost frightened by the echo that answered back. The walls themselves seemed to remember. The scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the hallway. His jacket hung by the door, stiff and untouched, as though he might return at any moment to slip it on. In the bedroom, the indentation on his side of the mattress remained, a hollow that his wife could not bring herself to smooth away. Even the smallest details, the way his tools remained neatly aligned in the garage, the half-read newspaper folded on the arm of his chair, became relics of a life interrupted. Neighbors who visited in those early days found the house heavy with an invisible presence. They brought casseroles, loaves of bread, awkward offers of help, but each visit ended with the same uneasy silence. Whispers passed across hedges and driveways. How does a man disappear from his own roof? Some neighbors avoided eye contact with the family, unsettled by the mystery, while others leaned into speculation, creating stories to fill the void. His wife could feel the eyes of the community on her whenever she stepped outside, as though she carried not only her grief but also the burden of everyone else's curiosity. Time, instead of healing, stretched the wound wider. Days bled into weeks, then into months, with no word, no trace. The police visits became less frequent, their questions more perfunctory, their voices edged with impatience. Without evidence of foul play, without a body, the case sat uneasily between accident and abandonment. Each time an officer closed his notebook and left, the family felt another door shutting, another small erasure of hope. Inside the home, normal routines dissolved. Mealtimes grew quiet, conversations reduced to clipped exchanges. Laughter, once abundant, sounded foreign when it occasionally slipped out, quickly swallowed by guilt. The radio played softly in the kitchen, not for enjoyment but to mask the silence. Photographs of him remained in place on the walls, but now they felt almost accusatory, frozen smiles staring back at those left behind. His wife sometimes found herself whispering to them, as though the images might answer when reality refused to. The nights were the hardest. The creak of the roof, the rustle of wind against the shingles, every sound reminded them of where he had been last seen. The wife lay awake listening for footsteps that never came, imagining the front door opening, imagining the weight of his hand brushing hers as he slid into bed. The children's nightmares grew frequent, dreams of rooftops collapsing, of voices calling from empty fields, of a father's silhouette slipping out of reach. They woke crying, and she held them tightly, but her arms could not replace the absence that had hollowed their lives. With each passing month, the house itself seemed to change. Paint began to peel around the window frames, shingles loosened again on the roof, the garden grew untended. What once had been a place of warmth and order began to mirror the family's unraveling. Friends who had once visited often came less and less, until the house stood almost alone at the end of the street, marked not by its architecture but by its story. To many in the neighborhood, it became the house where the father vanished, a place whispered about, a place avoided. Yet for the family, it was all they had left of him. Every room carried traces of his life, and leaving would have felt like abandoning him a second time. They held on tightly, even as the house grew heavier with memories and silence. It became a museum of sorts, not by intention but by necessity, each object a clue, each room a shrine to the man who had once filled it. And so the house remained, suspended in a state of waiting, its walls absorbing grief and unanswered questions. It was not just a structure of wood and stone anymore, but a living memory, breathing with absence, echoing with the voices of those left behind. For them, the house was no longer home, it was the embodiment of the mystery itself, a constant reminder of the day the roof swallowed their father and left only shadows in his place. The disappearance did not remain contained within the walls of the house. It seeped outward into the neighborhood, into every whispered conversation over fences and every glance exchanged on quiet sidewalks. At first, the neighbors were kind, offering what comfort they could, but beneath the casseroles and polite words there simmered a fascination that bordered on unease. A man vanishing without a trace was not the kind of story people could easily set aside. it clung to them, demanding explanation. And so, each person began to recall what they thought they had seen, layering memory with rumor until the line between fact and invention blurred beyond recognition. Some remembered him as cheerful that day, whistling softly while hammering down the shingles, waving at a neighbor's child who had been riding her bike past the house. To them, he was in good spirits, relaxed, a man with no reason to disappear. But others recalled something different, a heavy expression, the way he lingered on the roof between hammer strokes, staring off into the distance as if preoccupied. One man claimed the father had looked almost burdened, like someone carrying a secret. These contradictions only deepened the mystery, giving rise to competing versions of the same afternoon. Then there were the peculiar details, the ones that seemed trivial at the time but, in retrospect, became charged with meaning. A woman across the street said she had noticed a dark sedan parked on the curb that day, a car she didn't recognize. It had remained there for nearly an hour, engine idling, before pulling away. She could not describe the driver, only the shape of the vehicle and the uneasy feeling it gave her. Another neighbor swore she heard voices near the house just before dusk, low, hurried, almost urgent. When she looked outside, though, the street was empty, and the only sound was the creak of the ladder still propped against the house. Stories multiplied. One elderly neighbor insisted he saw the father climb down from the roof that evening, but when asked again later, his memory faltered, had it been that day or another? A young boy said he saw someone walking through the backyard carrying a bag, but his details shifted each time he was pressed for clarity. The community became its own unreliable narrator, each recollection shaped by imagination, by fear, by the desire to make sense of something senseless. The whispers soon took on a life of their own. At barbecues, in church parking lots, at the grocery store, people leaned in close to trade theories. Some said he had run away, leaving his family behind without warning. Others suggested foul play, that someone had been waiting for him, that the roof was merely the stage for something darker. A few even ventured into the territory of superstition, hinting at curses, at the idea that some houses carried their own shadows. To those on the outside, the story was entertainment, a chilling anecdote. But for the family, it was a wound being reopened each time. His wife felt the weight of these conversations pressing against her whenever she walked down the street. The stares lingered too long, the smiles were too polite. She knew what they were thinking. Perhaps she knew more than she was telling, perhaps there had been arguments behind closed doors, perhaps she was hiding something. The absence of answers created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured suspicion. Even the children felt it, noticing how their classmates whispered, how teachers spoke to them with a strange softness, as if pity might ease the ache. As weeks passed, the neighborhood itself began to shift. The father's absence became part of its landscape, as though the street now carried a permanent scar. Children dared each other to walk past the house at night, claiming they heard footsteps on the roof. Adults lowered their voices when passing by, unable to look directly at the empty windows. The community could not decide if the house was cursed, haunted, or simply unlucky, but they agreed on one thing: it was no longer ordinary. Yet even within the fog of rumor, there were moments of startling clarity. A neighbor recalled how the father had once mentioned debts, muttered under his breath about being in over his head. Another remembered seeing him speaking quietly to a man by the fence days before he vanished, their conversation tense, their faces unreadable. These fragments raised more questions than they answered. If he was in trouble, why had he climbed onto the roof that day as though everything was normal? And if he had chosen to leave, why had he left his tools behind, his work unfinished, his family without even a word? The community's memories, colored by their own fears and assumptions, became like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Each story added a new possibility, but none revealed the truth. And as the weeks turned into months, the neighbors' chatter grew less frequent, replaced by a resigned silence. Yet the mystery remained embedded in their minds, resurfacing in small, unexpected ways. A glance at the roof as they drove past, the sound of a hammer reminding them of that summer afternoon. In the end, the neighborhood held as much uncertainty as the family itself. No one could say with certainty what they had seen or heard. They carried fragments, impressions, and suspicions, but the full picture remained elusive. The man's disappearance had become part of the very identity of the street, a ghost story living in daylight, whispered in doorways, etched into memory. And though time dulled the sharpness of those early conversations, the echo of that day lingered, a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us can vanish in ways that defy explanation. He had always been known, at least on the surface, as a steady man. The kind of father who worked quietly, who came home smelling of sawdust and sweat, who carried himself with a presence that was firm but never overbearing. To neighbors, he seemed dependable, the kind of person who waved while mowing the lawn, who offered to help carry groceries, who nodded politely at Sunday gatherings. But beneath that ordinary veneer, there were signs, small, easily overlooked moments, that suggested his life was not as simple as it appeared. Those who knew him best described him as a man of contradictions. He could be warm and attentive, kneeling on the carpet to play with his youngest daughter or sharing long, unhurried conversations with his wife over coffee. But he could just as quickly become withdrawn, falling silent at the dinner table, staring past his plate as though lost in thoughts he refused to share. His children learned to read the signs, the tightening of his jaw, the way he rubbed his temples when something weighed on him. It was not anger that consumed him in those moments, but something heavier, something unspoken. Financial strain loomed over the family during those years, though it was rarely discussed aloud. He had taken on extra work, patching roofs, fixing fences, lending his skills wherever he could. The economy of the mid-80s had not been kind to men like him, men who relied on calloused hands and reliable labor. He never admitted the extent of his struggles, but late at night, when he thought the house was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with bills spread across the wood, head bowed, pencil tapping nervously against the paper. His wife sometimes found him there at dawn, still awake, his coffee long gone cold. There were also whispers of debts, small at first, then larger, the kind that can choke a man without ever leaving a visible mark. A friend recalled him mentioning a loan he regretted taking, his words clipped, his tone evasive. Others hinted at acquaintances who lingered on the edges of respectability, men who made deals in bars, who offered easy money at impossible costs. If he had crossed paths with such people, he never spoke of it openly. But there were moments when he seemed to flinch at the sound of an unexpected knock at the door, when he paused before answering the phone, as if bracing himself for something on the other end. And yet, for all his worries, he was still remembered as a man who loved his family fiercely. He carved toys for his children from scraps of wood, smoothing the edges carefully, painting them bright colors. He insisted on Sunday outings to the park, carrying sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, laughing as he pushed his children on the swings. His wife remembered those moments most clearly, the warmth of his hand in hers, the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. She clung to these memories after his disappearance, holding them against the darker hints of who he might have been. Friends and relatives painted an equally conflicted picture. A brother recalled how he once dreamed of leaving the small town behind, moving to the coast, starting fresh. But responsibility had weighed him down, tethering him to a life he never admitted was too small for him. A cousin remembered him as a storyteller, quick with a joke, but with eyes that sometimes betrayed a depth of sadness no one dared to question. These recollections, gathered in the years after his vanishing, created a portrait of a man caught between devotion and despair. There were other peculiarities that lingered in hindsight. Days before he disappeared, he withdrew a small amount of cash from the bank, nothing dramatic, but unusual for him. He also visited a hardware store, purchasing more supplies than the roof required. A neighbor recalled seeing him walk the perimeter of his property late one evening, as though checking something, his figure moving in and out of the glow of the porch light. When asked later what he had been doing, his wife admitted she had no idea. Even in his faith, there was ambiguity. Though he attended church sporadically, when he did, he sat quietly, listening with an intensity that made others uneasy. One friend said he confessed, once and only once, that he sometimes felt watched, though he never clarified by whom or by what. Another friend insisted that in the weeks before his disappearance, he seemed almost lighter, as though a burden had been lifted, or as if he had made a decision he was keeping secret. It is this blend of contradictions, devoted yet burdened, steady yet restless, hopeful yet fearful, that makes his story so haunting. He was not a man who fit neatly into a single narrative. He was neither wholly content nor wholly troubled. He carried love in one hand and silence in the other. Perhaps that is why his disappearance felt so disorienting. It wasn't simply that he vanished from a rooftop one afternoon, it was that no one could say, with certainty, which version of him had vanished. The devoted father? The weary provider? The man carrying secrets no one had the courage to ask about? In the years after, his wife often replayed their final days together, searching for overlooked signs. Was there something in his expression she had missed? Did his words carry hidden meanings? She remembered him looking at the children one morning, a long, unbroken gaze that seemed almost like farewell. She remembered him holding her hand the night before the roof repairs, gripping it with unusual force. At the time, she thought it was affection. Later, she wondered if it had been something else entirely, an unspoken goodbye. The father who disappeared in 1985 was not a simple man. He was a tangle of love and fear, of devotion and secrecy, of presence and absence even before he was gone. To tell his story is to confront the unsettling truth that sometimes the people closest to us are strangers in ways we cannot fathom. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, not the act of his vanishing, but the question of who he truly was in the moments before the world lost him. The first year after his disappearance unfolded like a slow and unrelenting storm, quiet on the surface but tearing at everything beneath. The house, already heavy with absence, became a place of suspended time, a calendar that no longer moved forward. Days were measured not by school schedules or mealtimes but by phone calls that never came, letters that never arrived, and the constant ache of waiting. The family learned to live in fragments, caught between hope and despair, each season marking a different stage of grief that never seemed to settle. In the early weeks, there was still urgency, a belief that answers were only a step away. His wife rose before dawn to call hospitals, scoured newspapers for reports of unidentified men, and visited the police station so often that the officers began to recognize her footsteps before she entered. She carried a photo of him everywhere, pressing it into the hands of strangers, asking if they had seen him. Each no carved deeper lines into her face, but she kept searching, convinced that persistence might summon him back. The children clung to her determination at first. They stood in doorways, waiting for a figure to appear at the end of the street. The youngest drew pictures of him on rooftops, always with a smile, as if he was still up there working, just beyond reach. The eldest grew restless, asking questions their mother could not answer. Why wasn't he home yet? Why weren't the police doing more? His anger simmered, sharp and uncontainable, spilling into arguments that left the house filled with slammed doors and muffled sobs. But as weeks slipped into months, hope began to fray. The police visits grew less frequent, their clipped reassurances hollow. These cases take time, they said, their voices already fading with disinterest. The missing posters weathered in the rain, peeling from telephone poles, their ink running like tears. Even the neighbors, once curious and supportive, began to drift away, their sympathy replaced with avoidance. No one wanted to linger too long near a house that seemed to carry its own shadow. By the time autumn arrived, the family's lives had begun to fracture. His wife, once careful and composed, moved through the house like a ghost. She cooked meals she could not eat, washed clothes no one wore, and left the porch light on every night as if guiding him back. She became obsessed with routines, convinced that keeping life orderly might tether him to them, might remind him where he belonged. Yet inside her, a quiet desperation grew, a fear that she was clinging to something already lost. The children adjusted in their own painful ways. The eldest, pressed into a role he never asked for, began to distance himself. He stopped asking about his father, stopped waiting at the window. He buried himself in schoolwork and chores, carrying burdens too heavy for his age. His sister, unable to retreat into silence any longer, began writing in journals, page after page of imagined conversations with her father. Sometimes she wrote as though he were speaking back, his voice steady, reassuring her that he was safe. The youngest, still too small to understand the permanence of absence, continued to search for him in dreams, waking in tears when she realized he had not returned. Holidays became cruel markers of his absence. On Thanksgiving, the table felt too large, his chair glaringly empty. At Christmas, the children opened gifts that brought no joy, their laughter faltering under the weight of what was missing. His wife kept one wrapped gift aside, a habit she continued year after year. A sweater, a book, sometimes just a card, tokens for a man who never came to claim them. Each holiday was less about celebration and more about endurance, an exercise in pretending normalcy while grief seeped into every corner of the room. Winter brought a deeper stillness. The snow on the roof glistened in the moonlight, a cruel reminder of the place where he was last seen. The children huddled close to the fireplace, while their mother stared into the flames, her face lit by flickers of orange and shadow. It was during these months that her hope began to waver. She confessed to a friend, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she sometimes wished she knew for certain, even if it meant the worst, because not knowing was a torture worse than grief itself. By spring, the world outside seemed to move on. Gardens bloomed, neighbors planned barbecues, children played in the streets again. But inside the house, time remained broken. The family existed in a state of limbo, caught between the life they had once known and the void left behind. His wife tried to reassemble herself, taking small jobs to keep the household afloat, but every paycheck was a reminder of what he had once provided. Every decision, no matter how small, carried the unspoken weight of his absence. Through it all, the community's perception of the family shifted. Some offered quiet sympathy, while others let suspicion creep into their voices. Whispers circulated, perhaps he had wanted to leave, Perhaps he had secrets, perhaps the family knew more than they admitted. These rumors stung, but the family could not silence them. They carried their grief publicly, their lives unfolding under the watchful eyes of neighbors who alternated between pity and doubt. As the one-year mark approached, the family faced a cruel reckoning. Anniversaries are supposed to mark celebrations, but this one only measured how long they had endured without him. On that day, his wife lit a single candle on the kitchen table, its flame flickering in the drafty silence. The children sat beside her, each lost in their own thoughts, none of them speaking. Outside, the street moved as usual, cars passing, dogs barking, life continuing. But inside, time remained tethered to the moment he had disappeared, a wound that had refused to close. The year of shadows did not end with answers. It ended only with exhaustion, with a family worn down by waiting. The hope that had once burned brightly had become something quieter, thinner, like embers that refused to die but no longer offered warmth. They had survived the year, but survival was not healing. Survival was simply learning to carry the weight of absence, day after day, without knowing if it would ever be lifted. And in that silence, in that endless waiting, the mystery of his disappearance grew even larger, casting its shadow over every moment of their lives. The years that followed did not bring clarity. Instead, they stretched into an uneasy rhythm, where life moved forward on the surface but underneath everything remained unresolved. The family learned to function around the absence, like a body compensating for a missing limb. They carried the wound of that day in 1985 into each new season, each new chapter of their lives, and though they tried to appear whole, the fracture was always visible if you looked closely. By the second and third years, the official search had slowed to a crawl. The police no longer knocked on their door with updates. The case file, once actively shuffled between detectives, now gathered dust in some forgotten drawer. What had once been labeled urgent was quietly reclassified as cold. His wife, unable to accept that silence, tried to keep the investigation alive on her own. She clipped articles about missing people, wrote letters to local officials, and attended community meetings where she brought up his name even when the subject had long since shifted. But every effort ended the same way, with sympathetic nods, promises that led nowhere, and an empty drive home where the weight of futility pressed harder with each mile. Meanwhile, the children were growing older, their memories of him shifting into something fragile and uncertain. The eldest, now entering late adolescence, began to resent the silence more than the absence. He demanded answers in ways that frightened his mother, pressing the police with questions they would not answer, accusing them of giving up too easily. He even went to the roof one evening, standing at the edge where his father had last worked, as if hoping that by placing himself in the same spot he could feel the truth. But all he felt was the dizzying pull of gravity and the emptiness of unanswered questions. His sister turned deeper into writing, filling journal after journal with theories and daydreams, crafting stories where her father had been taken, hidden, or chosen to leave. In her imagination, she gave him motives, struggles, even noble sacrifices, anything that could explain the void. She once confessed to a friend that sometimes she preferred her imagined versions to reality, because in them, her father still existed, even if he was unreachable. The youngest began to lose pieces of him altogether. Memories faded, replaced with second-hand stories told by siblings and their mother. She remembered his laugh in fragments, his smell like sawdust and soap, but sometimes she asked questions that made her siblings uneasy. What color were his eyes? Did he like music? Did he ever read bedtime stories? The answers came haltingly, as though speaking them aloud risked admitting how much they themselves were forgetting. The house changed, too. What was once a place filled with his presence, the sound of tools clinking, boots by the door, his voice humming absent-mindedly as he worked, became a space frozen in contradiction. His wife kept some of his belongings untouched, the jacket still hanging on a hook, his toolbox in the shed, the books he had left on the nightstand. These objects became talismans, proof that he had once been there, even as dust slowly claimed them. At the same time, new objects appeared, school trophies, report cards, bills, that bore no trace of him. The house was both shrine and stranger, memory and betrayal. The wider world, indifferent to their pain, kept turning. Neighbors who had once been supportive began to avoid the topic entirely. Invitations to gatherings grew rare. Whispers persisted. Maybe he had run off with another woman, maybe he had debts, maybe his family knew more than they admitted. The family heard these rumors but rarely confronted them. They lived with the sting of suspicion like one more shadow they could not escape. By the 5th year, his wife faced a cruel practicality, declaring him legally dead. Without it, there were endless complications, property, finances, school forms for the children. But to sign the papers felt like betrayal. She delayed it as long as she could, but eventually, with her hands trembling, she placed her signature on a document that reduced him to a status, a category in a bureaucratic system. She did it in silence, without telling the children until afterward, as though speaking it aloud would solidify something she still could not bear to accept. And yet, despite the legal finality, emotionally nothing was settled. For the family, he remained suspended, neither alive nor gone, both everywhere and nowhere. His absence shaped every choice they made. The eldest carried bitterness like armor, determined never to depend on anyone again. The middle child clung to her journals, pouring her pain into words that only deepened with time. The youngest, growing into adolescence, struggled with a hollow in her identity, a constant ache of not fully knowing the man whose blood ran in her veins. The roof where he disappeared loomed over them through the years. Every time it needed repair, the family hesitated, unable to bring themselves to climb it. Instead, they let neighbors help or paid strangers to fix it. For them, the rooftop was no longer part of their home. It was a wound, a scar in wooden shingles that never healed. Through all of this, the question of why never loosened its grip. If he had fallen, why was there no trace? If he had left, why no word? If something darker had happened, who carried that secret? The lack of answers became its own form of torment, a silence that grew louder with every passing year. And so, time stretched onward, years folding into a decade, with the family trapped in a story without resolution. They adapted, yes, but adaptation was not healing. It was survival. And beneath that survival lay a haunting truth. The disappearance did not just take him, it took the family they once were, leaving behind fragments that could never quite fit together again. The years had stretched long, and by the late 1990s, the family had learned to wear their grief like a second skin. Outwardly, life looked almost ordinary. They went to school, they worked, they celebrated birthdays and holidays, but under the surface everything still pulsed with absence. It was around this time that a small, almost accidental discovery would stir the mystery back to life, igniting questions that had lain dormant for more than a decade. It began with a neighbor, a man who had lived on the same street for years but was not particularly close to the family. He had been cleaning out his garage one humid summer afternoon, sorting through old boxes, when he stumbled upon something peculiar wedged behind a stack of forgotten paint cans. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a plain envelope, its edges yellowed with age, dust clinging to its surface. But when he brushed it off, he noticed the handwriting across the front, familiar enough to make him pause. It was the missing father's handwriting, neat but firm, the kind that carried intention. The neighbor stood there for a long moment, unsure what he was holding. Memories of 1985 flooded back, the frantic search, the missing posters, the unanswered questions. He remembered how the family's house had seemed swallowed by sorrow, how the wife had walked the streets with that photo in her hand, asking everyone she met. And now here, in his own garage, sat an envelope that bore the handwriting of the man who had vanished. His hands trembled as he turned it over, half afraid that opening it would unleash something he wasn't prepared to face. Word spread quickly. When he brought the envelope to the family, there was disbelief at first. The wife stared at it as though it were an apparition, her breath shallow, her fingers hovering but unwilling to touch. The children, now grown, crowded around the kitchen table where it was laid, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. No one wanted to be the first to open it, as though the act itself would shatter the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it contained answers. When they finally did open it, the contents were disarmingly simple, a folded sheet of paper, written in the father's unmistakable hand. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. It was not a confession, nor a farewell. Instead, it was a short note, cryptic in its brevity. If something happens, look under the place where the sun never reaches. That was all. No date, no signature, no explanation. Just a sentence that felt like both a clue and a taunt. The room filled with questions, one colliding into the next. What did it mean? Why had it been left with the neighbor? Was it written before he disappeared, or after? The eldest son grew angry, slamming his fist on the table, demanding answers from a piece of paper that could not respond. His sister clutched the note like a relic, reading it over and over, searching for hidden meaning in every loop of the handwriting. Their mother wept silently, her tears falling onto the faded ink, as though afraid she might wash it away. The discovery unsettled the neighborhood as well. Some whispered that the note was a prank, planted years later to stir up old pain. Others speculated that it was a message from the father himself, proof that he had not died but had chosen to vanish, leaving behind riddles instead of explanations. For the family, the envelope reopened wounds they had struggled to seal. It resurrected hope, yes, but it also deepened confusion. Because with hope came the possibility of betrayal. If he had lived all these years, why had he never come home? The note became a fixation. They debated its meaning late into the night, tracing and retracing the words as though they were a map. The place where the sun never reaches. Was it a literal location? The basement? The attic? The crawlspace beneath the house? Or was it symbolic, pointing toward something darker, hidden in the shadows of his life? The family began searching the house again, tapping on walls, prying open floorboards, descending into the cellar with flashlights that cut thin beams into the darkness. Every creak and echo set their nerves on edge, but they found nothing, only dust, cobwebs, and the weight of their own desperation. The envelope shifted the rhythm of their lives. For weeks, maybe months, they lived inside the mystery all over again, as though time had rewound to 1985. Conversations circled endlessly around theories. Some nights ended in arguments, voices raised, doors slammed. Other nights ended in silence, each family member alone with their thoughts, haunted by what they did not know. Yet amid the tension, there was also a strange spark of closeness. For the first time in years, the father's absence was not just a silent wound but an active question they all leaned toward together. In the uncertainty, they rediscovered something like unity, even if it was fragile, even if it was built on shadows. But beneath that unity, fear persisted. Because if the note was real, if it was meant to lead them somewhere, then it meant that their father's disappearance was not just an accident or a tragedy. It meant there had been intention. It meant secrets were buried somewhere close, in places the sun never reached. And secrets, they all knew, could be far more dangerous than silence. The note became an obsession. Its words, simple, almost childlike, echoed through the family's minds like a riddle they could never escape. If something happens, look under the place where the sun never reaches. They repeated it to themselves in quiet moments, whispering it aloud as though the sound might reveal its secret. They scribbled it on scraps of paper, circled it in journals, even taped a copy above the kitchen table. What had first felt like a lifeline soon turned into a labyrinth. The eldest son, practical and restless, took the message literally. He returned to the house with tools, prying at floorboards, crawling under the foundation, combing the attic with a flashlight. Dust clung to his skin, cobwebs tangled in his hair, but he found nothing but the hollow echo of his own footsteps. Still, he kept searching, driven less by hope than by anger. If there's something hidden, I'll find it, he muttered, as if sheer force of will could drag the truth into daylight. His sister, ever the dreamer, believed the phrase carried symbolic weight. To her, the place where the sun never reaches meant secrets, unspoken truths, or perhaps even the corners of memory where pain had been tucked away. She dove into her journals, writing page after page of interpretations. Sometimes it was the basement, sometimes a metaphor for the human heart, sometimes even a grave. Her theories changed daily, but each one left her with the same restless ache, that her father had left behind not an answer, but a puzzle designed to torment them. Their youngest sibling, now a teenager, tried to make sense of it in quieter ways. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, repeating the words until they blurred into nonsense. She didn't want clues or riddles, she wanted her father. She wanted the sound of his voice, the weight of his arms around her. For her, the note was a cruel replacement for the man himself, a shadow that could never fill the space he had left behind. The mother watched her children spin into obsession, and her own grief deepened into something more complex. For years, she had carried a silent hope that one day he might walk through the door, unchanged, ready to resume the life they had been forced to abandon. The envelope shattered that illusion. If he had left behind this cryptic message, then he had known something she didn't. He had carried secrets she was never meant to share. And that thought cut deeper than his absence itself. The family began retracing old steps. They revisited the police, clutching the note like evidence. But the detectives, long removed from the case, offered little more than polite shrugs. One officer admitted the handwriting looked genuine, but without a date or context, it meant nothing in the eyes of the law. It could have been written any time, he said flatly, as though the decades of pain in their faces were just another unsolved file. They turned to neighbors, asking if anyone remembered seeing their father deliver an envelope, or if anyone else had ever mentioned a hidden place. The neighborhood, once so alive with whispers, had changed. Many families had moved away. Those who remained shook their heads, offering sympathetic smiles tinged with unease. To bring up the missing man after so many years felt like reopening a wound the whole street had learned to ignore. Still, the note's presence shifted everything. It colored their memories, casting doubt on details they had once believed solid. Had his disappearance really been sudden? Or had there been signs they missed, cryptic comments, unusual behavior, a man burdened by something he never said aloud? The mother found herself replaying conversations in her mind, straining to hear meaning in words spoken years before. The children questioned whether his silences, his long stares out the window, had carried weight they were too young to understand. As weeks stretched into months, the family began to fracture under the pressure of interpretation. The eldest grew bitter, insisting the note proved abandonment, that their father had walked away, leaving them behind with nothing but riddles. His sister argued the opposite, convinced it was a warning, proof that he had known danger was near. Their youngest begged them to stop, her voice breaking as she confessed she couldn't bear to live inside the mystery any longer. "I just want him to be my dad," she cried. But the note refused to release them. The house itself seemed to lean into the riddle. Shadows stretched longer in its corners, the basement felt colder, the attic more oppressive. Every creak in the night carried new weight, as if the building itself held its breath, hiding something just beyond their reach. Even the roof, once simply the site of his disappearance, now loomed like a watchful sentinel, guarding its secrets. One evening, after yet another fruitless search, the mother sat alone at the kitchen table, the note spread before her. She traced the words with her finger, her tears falling silently. And in that quiet moment, she realized what haunted her most, not that her husband had vanished, not even that he might have suffered, but that he had known something, carried something, and left her to discover it only through this cruel, cryptic sentence. The note was not just a clue. It was a burden, handed down to them without warning, a weight they were now forced to carry. And so the envelope, instead of offering answers, became yet another layer of the mystery. It tethered the family to the past once more, reawakening old wounds, sharpening suspicions, and ensuring that the shadow of 1985 would never fade. The words remained etched in their minds, a riddle carved into their lives, the place where the sun never reaches. Whether it was a clue, a warning, or a goodbye, they could not yet know. All they knew was that the mystery was not finished, and that the truth, whatever it was, still waited in the dark. The discovery of the envelope had lit a fire the family could not extinguish, but as months passed, the fire became something else, a smoldering, choking haze that filled their lungs and clouded their thoughts. The words of the note circled endlessly in their minds, looping in conversations, arguments, and solitary whispers. It was as though their father's handwriting had clawed its way back from the past to demand attention, refusing to let them rest. The eldest son took it upon himself to chase the mystery with the intensity of a man possessed. Now in his 20s, he began traveling to libraries, poring over old newspapers, combing through archives that stretched back decades. He wasn't just searching for his father anymore, he was hunting for patterns, stories of other disappearances, whispers of corruption, anything that might explain how a man could simply vanish from a rooftop and leave behind only a riddle. His notebooks filled with names, dates, theories scrawled in furious handwriting. But the more he found, the less he understood. Each discovery only widened the web of possibilities, until his walls were covered with clippings and strings that looked less like a map and more like a trap. His sister, still bound to her journals, shifted her writing from memory to interpretation. She began crafting stories about what might have happened, short vignettes where her father was the central figure, sometimes a victim, sometimes a fugitive, sometimes a man living under another name in another town. Her words blurred the line between fiction and truth, until even she no longer knew if she was remembering her father or inventing him. In her stories, she gave him voice, let him explain himself, let him soothe her in ways reality never had. But when she closed the notebook, the silence remained, harsher than ever. The youngest, too young to remember her father clearly, struggled most of all. She listened to her siblings' theories and watched her mother's silence, and inside her grew a quiet resentment. How could she love a man she barely knew? How could she mourn someone who existed more as a shadow than a memory? Yet at the same time, she envied them, the way they could recall his laugh, his smell, his presence. She longed for even one clear memory of her own. Sometimes she searched for him in dreams, conjuring a face that was more imagined than remembered, a voice cobbled together from what others told her. Waking up from those dreams was the cruelest part, because reality always greeted her with emptiness. Their mother, once the anchor of the family, began to drift. The envelope had undone years of work she had put into holding herself together. She became distant, distracted, her gaze often fixed on the horizon as though waiting for someone to arrive. She stopped sleeping through the night, her steps echoing through the house in the early hours as she checked locks, opened drawers, touched his jacket still hanging by the door. Her silence grew heavier than words. When asked what she thought the note meant, she only shook her head. It was not that she didn't have ideas, it was that she feared the truth might be worse than any theory her children could invent. Outside the family, the envelope stirred rumors once more. Neighbors who had long since buried the story began to talk again, their voices laced with both fascination and unease. Some claimed the father had been involved in things the family knew nothing about,